Hi everyone, thanks for checking out my video. I originally started this to make a point to some particularly problematic things in the fandom, but it became more of an educational thing. I hope this helps clear things up for some of you. We're going to be talking about the MCU with variants and timelines, especially with the Loki show. I've noticed people have been getting a little confused about timelines and variants. Mainly, people seem to be kind of missing the message of the show Loki about variants. They aren't the same people. And you might say, but the TVA and Kang say they're the same. Yes, well, one thing we also see is that the TVA is full of propaganda. Just take a look around. There are a creepy amount of posters full of propaganda that are somewhat reminiscent of the gung-ho World War II posters made to try and get people to help the war effort. And that's only posters. There's a lot more to the propaganda we see in the TVA. They're also not the good guys. So yeah, take what they have to say with a grain of salt. Sure, variants might share traits, some more than others, but they aren't actually the same people. They were just handed the same lot in life. Of course, as we get into more different timelines, those purposes might be a lot more different, or not even connected at all. However, that seems to be more of a comic thing, and in those cases, the variants are generally connected by identity and DNA. Take Gwen Stacy, for example. We have Gwen Stacy from Earth 616, the first variation of Gwen we knew, the one who was Peter Parker's love interest and tragically died. Then we have Gwen Stacy from Earth 95, the one you know by names like Spider-Woman, Ghost Spider, and by the fans, Spider-Gwen. These two ended up playing very different roles. Then we have Mary Jane from Earth 616 versus Mary Jane in Earth 8545. One is the Mary Jane you grew up with seeing as Peter Parker's main love interest, and the other is Spider-Woman. And a lesbian, for that matter. That's an interesting point that I think is also worth noting. In addition to other things, not all variants necessarily share things like sexual orientation, gender identity, and the list goes on. A brief detour. I did have someone tell me that this was not the case with Loki and it was transphobic to say otherwise, which some people have harassed Kate Herron about relentlessly, saying the same about Loki and Sylvie's relationship. But I was given no proof except a comic title, which, when further looked into, only addressed one of the 616 Loki's gender. When asking others familiar with the comics, and I mean Loki experts, they said it was untrue that it was confirmed all Lokis are gender fluid. It took a very long time for even one Loki to be confirmed as gender fluid. Additionally, looking at the wiki, I saw a comic variant of Loki listed as gender fluid, while others were not due to limited proof. The Loki experts told me that variants of Loki aren't really explored a whole lot beyond plot, so there's not much, if any, information on their genders. We also need to understand that while there may have been various Lokis in 616, many are just him being reborn, rather than variants of him. Given that there are infinite possibilities, I see no reason that there wouldn't be timelines where Lokis are cis or trans but identify as something other than gender fluid. And of course, as I said earlier, the fact that they have different sexual orientations likely means they can have different genders. The closest comparisons we have to these MJs and Gwens in the MCU so far would be something like Captain Carter and Star-Lord T'Challa in What If. Especially the latter, as the Collector having artifacts belonging to characters who should be alive shows that there are other very big differences in that timeline. In cases like these, it's more about identity and or DNA than roles. We're going to focus mostly on Loki and his variants here, since this is obviously focusing on the MCU's definition of timelines, variants, etc. Now, we see a few different types of Lokis in this series, but first we're going to talk about the sacred timeline. Now, when you think of the sacred timeline, you probably think of something like this. A straight line, as we see on the little screens throughout the TVA over and over again. And this is right at first glance, but then we have to zoom into it. We're not looking at something as simple as a straight line. You see, the sacred timeline consists of multiple timelines, and in those timelines, some have different things, some more than others. Here we see a visual based on an interview with one of the scriptwriters of Loki. He compares the sacred timeline to a wire rope, which has a core and is surrounded by various wires that make up the whole thing. However, I'm really stupid and that confuses me, so we're going to use my own visual instead. I'm putting 3 timelines here for our convenience. Make it a bit easier to understand, hopefully. Line 1 belongs to Alligator Loki. Some people think it's as simple as, well, this Loki isn't human, so that's why his timeline was pruned. No. His Nexus event was not being an alligator, but eating the wrong neighbor's cat. There's still a timeline out there with an alligator Loki who is apparently supposed to eat a neighbor's cat, but it's no big deal. He's allowed to exist. He's part of the sacred timeline. Confusing? Don't worry, we'll get there. The next timeline is one we're familiar with. This one is Earth 199999, that is, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The baseline is the line we saw up until Endgame, the line where the original Loki, we're going to call him OG Loki, developed through the movies and died in Infinity War. Go back as far as you want in history, but you're probably never going to find a point where Loki Gator and OG Loki's timelines were one. These are two timelines with their own stuff going on. This is known as a parallel timeline. This little visual given at the beginning of the Loki series can be a bit confusing because it might seem like the timekeepers were making one timeline, but it's really just saying that they're taking a bunch of timelines and just putting them into one area that they're calling the sacred timeline. My visual isn't a whole lot clearer at first glance. It's multiple timelines, but imagine if you zoom out really far, it'll look like one thick line. That's the sacred timeline. Now, let's say I accidentally step on the wrong leaf during a walk. That causes the timeline to diverge. In the original script, I was supposed to step on the maple leaf, but here I stepped on the oak leaf. This, however, doesn't particularly matter. Well, unless for some reason the oak leaf had a huge impact on the world, but that's unlikely. So the diverging timeline runs parallel with the main timeline, but we're still going to call it a divergent timeline for convenience sake, and not go into the nitty-gritty of that stuff. So when we think parallel timelines, for now, let's just think of a timeline that never connected with the timeline we have now. We see this with TVA Loki, as we'll call him. TVA Loki was on the same course as OG Loki, but suddenly we take a wrong turn. He gets the Tesseract and he escapes. This is so crazy, so different, the timeline can potentially run in a completely different direction now. It's completely divergent. This is a divergent timeline. So in this case, TVA Loki and OG Loki are basically the same person. The same DNA, the same everything. They just developed differently. But they were originally from the same timeline. Then we have Alligator Loki. He was from a parallel timeline. He and our Lokis were never related. Obviously, I mean, sure, you could argue that he's maybe a Loki in disguise as an alligator, but there's no reason not to believe he's an alligator. The point is,
it can get weirder.
It is completely possible for a variant to be literally a different species than you. And if you want a non-species example to drive home the non-matching DNA part, Boastful Loki. Odin transformed Loki with magic to make him look Asgardian so he wouldn't know that he was adopted. That means he would have made Loki look like him, as in, not white in this case. Now let's take a quick stop and talk about what everyone's wondering. Sylvie. Is Sylvie related to Loki? Well, that depends if she's from a divergent or a parallel timeline. And for that, you have to ask yourself a question. Do you seriously think the writers would have had them fall in love if they were from divergent timelines? Do you think Disney would approve of that? No, they would not. I mean, there's incest in the comics, but in the MCU, which is owned by Disney, they're not going to be okay with that. So what makes Sylvie, Loki Gator, Boastful Loki, and TVA Loki variants of OG Loki? How are these people who are so different connected to their sacred timeline counterparts? For one thing, they're temporal auras. When the TVA is searching for Lokis, they don't look for Loki DNA, they look for temporal auras. Everyone has a unique temporal aura, though variants appear to share one.
Please confirm to your knowledge that you are not a fully robotic being. We're born an organic creature and do in fact possess what many cultures would call a soul.
What's that?
Your temporal aura.
What's that?
We've grabbed enough temporal aura to know it's our Loki variant, but which kind of Loki remains unknown.
Secondly, their purpose. What does that mean? Well, it depends on the person. It brings us to that question we hear again and again in the show.
What exactly makes a Loki a Loki?
Well, we hear a few different things.
Loki is an evil, lying scourge. That is the part he plays on the sacred timeline.
You weren't born to be king, Loki. You were born to cause pain and suffering and death. That's how it is. That's how it was. That's how it will be. All so that others can achieve their best versions of themselves.
Maybe their timelines differed. Maybe there are Lokis of different genders, races, species, sexualities, whatever. But what makes them the same is their purpose. They commit evil acts and serve as a way to help the heroes of our story develop into the people that they are. In the end, they become good in the last moments and die at the hands of Thanos. In the sacred timeline, that is what makes a Loki a Loki. But why are they all in the sacred timeline? Why do they all exist? Well, because they all follow the same basic formula. Kang doesn't need only one single timeline. Pruning timelines is akin to mass murder. He calls himself a villain for good reason. All that matters is that the timelines follow the basic core. Remember that little wire picture from earlier? That is the sacred timeline. The sacred timeline is not literally one timeline. It's a grand collection of many. These sacred timelines are okay to coexist because none of them will lead to evil Kangs like Kang the Conqueror and multiversal war. If I were to guess, they all lead to endings where he who remains is the one who ends up in charge. So that's why it's okay for them to coexist. It's okay for them to coexist until they go off course, eating the wrong cat, or, as is probably the case for Sylvie, becoming a good person despite the fact that she's a Loki and should be evil. But why am I so insistent that Lokis of the same species aren't related? Why am I so sure that parallel timelines are more akin to alternate realities? Well, interviews with cast and writers for one thing, but also something else. Spider-Man. Say hello to Peter Parker of Earth 199999. He is 16 and lives with his Aunt May. This is Aunt May. Say hello to Peter Parker of Earth 96283. He lives with his Aunt May. This is Aunt May. Here we have Peter Parker of Earth 12703. He lives with his Aunt May. And here she is. Notice something? Not only do they all look different, but all of the Aunt Mays are different ages. Of course, we also have J. Jonah Jameson in Far From Home, which may seem to contradict what I'm getting at, but that was pre-Multiverse and more of just a fun cameo than anything we need to think too deeply about. Now, with the Lokis, you can argue they're shapeshifters. You can argue they still share DNA and their timelines are all exactly the same except for their looks, though you don't really have any proof there. I personally assume that in the show, these Lokis that are shown are all from parallel timelines, because that's kind of the point they're trying to explore, that each of the Lokis have totally different pasts and are totally different people, though I guess in theory there are infinite timelines, so there should be timelines where the Lokis are exactly the same but just look different. But the ones in the show are most likely parallels. But yeah, whatever, back to Spideys. These Spideys all look different, yet they are variants. This is a leak of a toy from No Way Home. Looks legit. Heck, someone literally brought it home here. If you zoom in, it says on the back that this is a variant of Spider-Man. Even if you don't buy that it's real, it's still pretty obvious that they're variants at this point. The trailer basically confirms all the Peters are gonna meet.
Hello, Peter.
To quote someone on Tumblr, so when my head exploded in the first episode over how nonsensical the timeline seemed, and I called the sacred timeline just a bunch of timelines but tidied up with cable organizers, I was essentially right? Yes, my friend. Yes, you were.